Well, I've spent some time over the last several months, and granted I haven't made a video in a while, but I've just tried to describe my style, and I've tried to use I've tried to describe my style using the 6 play styles that have become kind of popular lately. And I've had to kind of have these caveats and exceptions and all these things that, otherwise modify how my style is different than the platonic ideal of that style. I think that's a little silly because I recall now, it's now many years ago, that there was something that came out called GM Merit Badges, where there was a guy who came up with these little images of all of these different style elements, and you just picked which ones applied to you, kind of like a buffet, and ignored the ones that did not. So, although it does not create labels for your play style per se, it does describe it in pretty exacting details. This is then my annotated GM Merit Badge list, all of the things that apply to my play style. And even though I first did this, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, quite a while ago now at least, reading over it again, I actually don't think anything has changed. My GM style kind of is what it is. So let's go through all of the different elements of my GM style as defined by the merit badges. The first one is the GM is in charge in my game, and Rule 0 is in effect. I'm a much bigger believer in rulings than in rules anyway, which I have in common with the OSR. Bogging down the game while I figure something out correctly is much less important to me than making a hand-wavy ruling using the tools of the mechanics in a way that seems to make sense. And for that matter, I prefer rules to take a backseat and for players to not necessarily always be aware of what rules and mechanics are in play at any given time. I don't tell them necessarily what saving throw DCs or armor classes are or things like that. I want to keep the mechanics more in the background and the in-game, in-character stuff firmly in the foreground. This immersion-seeking goal means the rules are not the most important thing going. Next, my games rely on a lot of improvisation rather than pre-scripted content. At most, I'll have a one-page outline of what I think is likely to happen, and that will often last for 3 or 4 sessions. I prefer my players to drive the game to activities that they find interesting based on hooks that I dangle in front of them, of course. But it's important to me that they have lots of hooks to choose from and do what they want to do. Of course, that also means I can only plan so much, so I have to make up a lot of stuff on the fly based on how my players choose. And even the scanty plans I do have often don't amount to a hill of beans when the PCs decide to do something I totally didn't anticipate. Although, to be fair, by this point I'm pretty good at anticipating what PCs are likely to do. When this happens, rather than try to force them back on track, I'm a fan of forcing the campaign itself to mold itself in their image and react to them. Next, my game will tell an interesting story. I think a lot of people think that this is mutually exclusive from improvisation, but I disagree. Just because I don't pre-write the campaign doesn't mean that I don't expect an interesting story to be the result of the game. Improvisational storytelling can still use a lot of structure from good storytelling, like pacing, foreshadowing, given player agency that can sometimes turn out to be a red herring that never comes to pass, but that's the risk you take, I guess, and impactful character moments. It's crucial to me to have players who are on the same page about this kind of stuff so that they design characters who have hooks for me to use in the backgrounds, just as I give hooks for them to use in my presentation of the scenarios and what the antagonists are doing. A good deal of collaboration and back and forth being on the same page about what we want out of the game is required. Otherwise, this stuff doesn't come together. But as a GM, I really push for it. I really work hard to create interesting antagonists in interesting scenarios who are interwoven with the PC's own backgrounds as much as possible. And if you do that, these kinds of stories write themselves in play, which is the point, rather than me plotting out, quote-unquote, the story before we even start playing. Next, My games focus on interesting characters and drama. In fact, that's what I like about the game. Tactics don't really work well for me in most RPGs because they don't have much to do with tactics as they would be applied in real life. If I'm going to do tactics, I'd rather play a tactical miniature game, not an RPG. And I do enjoy those, but I don't enjoy them when I'm trying to play a role-playing game. I approach the game from an authorial standpoint, and while I also really love the collaborative effort of working with players, either as GM or as a player myself, instead of quote-unquote writing my story, at the same time I like the game best when we're focused on trying to tell an interesting story. And that goes hand in hand with interesting characters and drama. In fact, with interesting characters and drama, a decent story is almost an inevitable product of the game. Next, my games will be scary. I'm a big fan of blending in lots of horror ghost story elements and consider my main game to belong to the dark fantasy genre, as vague as that label may yet be. This should be obvious given that I consider my playstyle paradigm to be much more firmly rooted in a Call of Cthulhu game than in Dungeons & Dragons, even though the setting and mechanics are more similar to a Dungeons & Dragons type game. If you don't like scary themes or find them too much to handle, then my game probably isn't really designed for you. No offense, it simply is what it is. That said, this can be overdone. I am not overtly and cartoonishly grimdark. Next, players in my game should be prepared to run when the odds are stacked against them. I'm not really a fan of killing PCs, but I won't hesitate to do so if it's the obvious result of player actions. And once again, horror, folks. In horror, you don't always stand up to the monster and gloriously battle it to the death. That is, you don't if you don't want really short, boring games. I don't believe in fairness quite as much as I believe in verisimilitude. That doesn't mean I'll punish you in the name of some kind of moral high ground in terms of playstyle, but it does mean that you aren't necessarily meant to kill everything you encounter. Don't try it. It'll go badly eventually. Next, my games could include disturbing content. Again, I like a fairly strong horror vibe. I consider my games to be pretty solidly in PG-13 territory. They're not really meant for kids. I'm very much against including gratuitous, shocking content, though. I dislike it in cinema and I dislike it in books. I won't ever be gratuitous. The disturbing content isn't necessarily the focus of any of my games. I merely give fair warning up front, though. It could be there, and you need to either be prepared for it before it happens or recuse yourselves before we start. Don't make too big a deal of this. I mean, the scriptures, for crying out loud, have plenty of disturbing content too if you read them all the way through. But this isn't bright and polite rainbows and unicorns fantasy. This is horror and crime stories in a fantasy setting. Next, there will be player versus player combat allowed in my games. I won't exactly encourage it, but I'm not going to stop it. I don't believe that RPGs are games about teamwork. Or rather, the teamwork is at the player level in creating an experience that is interesting and fun. That does not necessarily mean teamwork at the character level, and characters that do not get along are often the most interesting kinds. One important element for making this paradigm work is a degree of separation between the character and the player. Players are like a combination of limited author and character actor, but they shouldn't ever see their character as an extension of themselves. Bad things happening to their character is not bad things happening to the players themselves, and if bad things don't happen to the character, well, that isn't really a very interesting anyway, is it? Lastly, my games include lots of intrigue. In fact, I greatly prefer intrigue, skullduggery, and cloak and dagger affairs to dungeon crawls, which I cordially dislike. I'm not even sure that I can fairly call it cordial. I just dislike them, period. Thrillers, spies, mafioso types, assassins, plots, these are my meat and potatoes in terms of what I find interesting to game about. Think of your favorite mainstream spy thriller in movies or novels. Stuff like Robert Ludlum or Lee Child's. Movies like The Godfather. Apply these types of stories and that kind of tone to a fantasy already steeped in horror. And that's what I really want my games to be like. And that, as an a la carte buffet selection, is what my playstyle really is. The Shadow of Old Night playstyle.